Marcel Proust towards Swann, In Search of Lost Time, 1. To Gaston Carmit, as a token of deep and heartfelt gratitude. Part 1. Combray. I have long been accustomed to going to bed early. Sometimes, as soon as the candle went out, my eyes closed so quickly that I did not have time to say to myself, I'm falling asleep. And half an hour later I woke up from the thought that it was time to sleep. It seemed to me that the book was still in my hands and I had to put it down and put out the light. In the dream I continued to think about what I had read, but my thoughts took a rather strange direction. I imagined myself to be what was said in the book, the church, the quartet, the rivalry between Francis I and Charles V. This obsession lasted a few seconds after I woke up. It did not disturb my consciousness. It covered my eyes with scales and prevented them from making sure that the candle was not burning. Then it became vague, like a memory of a former life after metempsychosis. The plot of the book was separated from me. I was free to associate or not associate myself with it. Thereupon my sight returned, and to my astonishment I became convinced that there was darkness all around me, soft and soothing to the eyes, and perhaps even more soothing to the mind, to which it appeared as something inexplicable, incomprehensible, as something really dark. I asked myself what time it might be now. I heard the whistles of locomotives. From them it was possible to determine the distance. They evoked in my imagination the expanse of deserted fields, the traveler hurrying to the station and the path imprinted in his memory due to the excitement that he also experiences at the sight of unfamiliar places, and because he is now acting unusually, because he still remembers in the silence of the night the recent conversation, parting under a strange lamp, and comforts himself with the thought of a speedy return. I lightly brushed my cheeks against the soft cheeks of the pillow, as fresh and plump as the cheeks of our childhood. I struck a match and looked at the clock. It's almost midnight. This is the very moment when a sick traveler, forced to lie in an unfamiliar hotel, is awakened by an attack and he rejoices at the strip of light under the door. What a joy! It's already morning. Now the servants will rise, he will call, and they will come to his aid. Hope for relief gives him the strength to endure. And then he hears footsteps. Footsteps approach, then recede. And the strip of light under the door disappears. It's midnight, put out the gas. The last servant left, which means you will have to suffer all night. I fell asleep again, but sometimes I woke up just long enough to hear the characteristic crackling of the panels, to open my eyes and gaze around the kaleidoscope of darkness, to feel, thanks to an instant glimpse of consciousness, how things were fast asleep. The room, all that insensible part of which I was and with which I had to connect again. Or else, without the slightest effort, I was transported, falling asleep, into the irrevocable time of my early years, and childish fears again took possession of me. So, for example, I was afraid that my great-uncle would pull me by the hair, although I stopped being afraid of him after they cut my hair. This day marked the beginning of a new era in my life. In the dream, I forgot about this incident and again remembered as soon as I managed to wake up in order to escape from my grandfather. However, before returning to the dream world, out of caution, I hid my head under the pillow. Sometimes, while I was sleeping, a woman would emerge from the awkward position of my leg, like Eve emerging from Adam's rib. She was created by the pleasure I was anticipating, and I imagined that it was she who gave it to me. My body, sensing my own warmth in her body, strove for approachment, and I woke up. Other people, it seemed to me, were now far, far away, and from the kiss of this woman, with whom I had just parted, my cheek was still burning, and my body was languishing from the weight of her waist. When her features resembled a woman whom I knew in reality, I was seized by the desire to see her again. This is how people get on the road who cannot wait to look with their own eyes at the desired city. They imagine that in life you can enjoy the charm of a dream. Gradually, the memory dissipated. I forgot the girl in my dream. A thread of ours is stretched around a sleeping person. years and worlds are arranged in succession. Waking up, he instinctively checks with them, instantly reads in them where on the globe he is, how much time has passed before his awakening, but their ranks can mix up, get upset. If he suddenly falls asleep in the morning, after insomnia, reading a book, in an unusual position for him, then it is enough for him to stretch out his hand to stop the sun and turn it back. In the first minute he will not understand what time it is, it will seem to him as if he had just gone to bed. If he falls asleep in an even less natural, completely unusual position, for example, sitting in an armchair after dinner, then the worlds that have descended from their orbits will completely mix up. The magic chair will carry him with incredible speed through time, through space, and as soon as he opens his eyelids, it will seem to him as if he lay down a few months ago in other parts. But as soon as I fell asleep in my bed in a deep sleep, during which complete rest came for my consciousness lost its idea of the plan of the room in which I fell asleep. Waking up at night, I could not understand where I was. For the first second I even couldn't figure out who I was. The primitively simple sensation that I exist did not leave me. A similar sensation can also beat in the chest of an animal. I was poorer than a caveman, but then, like help from above, a memory came to me, not yet of the place where I was, but of the places where I lived before or could live, and pulled me out of non-existence, from which I could not get out with my forces. In an instant I ran through the centuries of civilization, and the vague notion of kerosene lamps, of shirts with turned-down collars gradually restored the features of my eye. Perhaps the immobility of the objects around us is inspired by our certainty that it is they, and not some other objects, by the immobility of what we think of them. Whenever I woke up under such circumstances, my mind tried in vain to establish where I was, and everything around me swirled in the dark. Objects, countries, years. My stiffened body, by the nature of fatigue, sought to determine its position, to draw from this the conclusion where the wall went, how the objects were arranged, and on the basis of this to imagine the dwelling as a whole and find a name for it. Memory. The memory of the sides, knees, shoulders, showed him room after room where he had to sleep, while invisible walls, spinning in the dark, moved depending on what shape the imaginary room had. And before the consciousness, which stopped in indecision on the threshold of forms and times, having compared the circumstances, recognized the dwelling place, the body recalled what kind of bed is in this or that room, where the doors are, where the windows open, whether there is a corridor, and at the same time recalled those thoughts with which I fell asleep and woke up. So, my numb side, trying to navigate, imagined that he was stretched out against the wall in a wide bed under a canopy, and then I said, "Ah, that's it." I did not wait for my mother to come to say goodbye to me, and fell asleep. I was in the village with my grandfather, who died many years ago. My body, the side that I lay in bed, the faithful guardians of the past, which my mind will never forget, brought to my memory the light made of Bohemian glass, in the form of an urn, a night lamp suspended from the ceiling on chains, and a fireplace made of Siena marble, which stood in my Combray bedroom, in the house of my grandparents, where I lived in the distant past, which I now took for the present, although I still did not visualize it clearly. It loomed more clearly when I finally awoke. Then the memory of a different position of the body awakened. The wall stretched in the other direction. I was in my room with Madame de Saint-Loup, in the country. Oh my God! It must be the 11th hour, probably already had dinner. I seemed to have slept long after my usual evening walk with Madame de Saint-Loup, the walk I take before putting on my tailcoat. Many years ago, when we were returning especially late from the walk in Combray, I saw the red reflections of the sunset on the panes of my window. In Tansonville, with Madame de Saint-Loup, they lead a very different way of life, and I feel a very special pleasure from walking in the evenings, by moonlight, along the roads on which I once frolicked in the sun. When we return, I see from a distance the room where I will first fall asleep, and then change for dinner. It is pierced by the rays from the lamp, from this single lighthouse in the darkness of the night. The whirlwind of vague memories lasted a few seconds each time. Often my short-term perplexity about where I was, distinguished the assumptions of which it was composed, no better than we dissect the movements of a running horse in a kinetoscope. And yet I saw first one and then another room where I happened to live, and in the end, while I woke up and indulged in dreams for a long time, I remembered every single one. Here are the winter rooms, where, lying down in bed, you bury your face in a nest. You twisted it from various objects, from the corner of the pillow, from the top of the blanket, from the edge of the shawl, from the edge of the bed, from the newspaper, and then, fastening all this in the way of birds, for an indefinite time you settle in it. Winter rooms, where it is especially pleasant for you to feel in the cold that you are fenced off from the outside world. This is how the sea swallow builds its nest deep underground, in the warmth of the earth, where the fire in the fireplace burns all night, and you sleep under a wide cloak of warm and smoky air, in which the lights of flashing firebrands flicker. You sleep in some ghostly alcove, in a warm cave dug inside the room, in a hot strip with moving borders, fanned in flows of air that refresh our face and that come from the corners of the room, from that part of it that is closer to the window and further from the fireplace, and therefore colder. Here are the summer rooms, where it is pleasant to merge with the warm night, where the moonlight, breaking through the half-opened shutters, throws its magical staircase to the foot of the bed, where you sleep as if in clean air, as a titmouse sleeps, which is swayed by a breeze at the tip of a sunbeam. Sometimes it is a room in the style of Louis XVI, so cheerful that even on the first evening I did not feel particularly unhappy there, a room where thin columns, effortlessly supporting the ceiling, parted with such grace to make room for a bed, not obscure her. Sometimes it was completely unlike her, small, but with a very high ceiling, partially furnished with mahogany, hollowed out at a 2-story height, a pyramid, where I was morally poisoned in the first second by the unfamiliar smell of nard and was convinced of the hostility of the purple curtains and the impudent indifference of the wall clock chirping with might and main, as if I were not there, where, alien to everything here, a merciless square mirror on legs, obliquely blocking one of the corners of the room, crashed into the pacifying filling of the space I had already explored with some sort of wasteland, which always gave the impression of surprise, where my thought, which had struggled for hours to disperse itself, to stretch itself high in order to take the exact shape of the room and fill its gigantic funnel to the top, was tormented for many painful nights, while I lay with open eyes, with a beating heart, straining my hearing, trying not to breathe through the nose until habit changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, inspired pity for the slanting cruel mirror, softened, if not completely expelled the smell of nard, and did not noticeably reduce the height of the ceiling that was conspicuous. A skillful habit, but too slow a beautician. At first, she does not pay attention to the torments that our consciousness endures for whole weeks in temporary dwellings, and yet the one who acquired it is happy, because without habit, on our own, we could not make a single room suitable for habitation. Now I was finally awake. My body described the last circle, and the kind angel of confidence stopped everything in my room, pulled a blanket over me and in the darkness more or less correctly replaced the chest of drawers, a desk, a fireplace, a window to the street and 2 doors. But although I now knew for sure that I was not in those rooms, whose appearance, although not clear enough, for a moment resurrected an inexperienced awakening in front of me, hinting that I could be there too, my memory was given an impetus. I usually didn't try to fall asleep immediately. Almost all night I remembered how we lived in Combray, with my great-aunt, in Belbec, in Paris, in Doncières, in Venice and in other cities. I remembered the area, the people I knew there, what I myself kept up with, noticed them and what others have told me about them. In Combray, at dusk, until the moment when I had to go to bed, my bedroom, where I languished without sleep, away from my mother and grandmother, turned for me into a painful center of anxiety. Since my view in the evenings was miserable, someone came up with an entertainment for me. Before dinner, a magic lantern was attached to my lamp, and, like the first architects and glass artists of the Gothic era, the lantern transformed impenetrable walls into ghostly play of light, into supernatural visions of many colors, into living legends, written on flickering, shifting glass. But that only made me sadder, because even the change in lighting was destroying my habit of the room, a habit that, apart from the agony of lying in bed, made me bearable here. Now I did not recognize my room and felt uncomfortable, as in a hotel room or in a chalet, where I would have got for the first time directly from the train. Consumed by evil intent, Gollo was cowardly on horseback, leaving a triangular grove that covered the hillside with dark green velvet. He trembled towards the castle of the unfortunate Genevieve of Brabant. The lock was beautifully cut, just the edge of an oval glass set into a frame that was pushed between the lentils of the lantern. It was only part of the castle. In front of her was a meadow, and in the meadow Genevieve dreamed of something in a dress with a blue belt. Both the castle and the meadow were yellow, and I knew this even before they showed me in the lantern. I saw clearly their color in the golden sounds of the word Brabant. Gollo stopped and sadly listened to the explanation, which my great-aunt read aloud. Apparently, this was quite understandable to him, for, in strict accordance with the text, he assumed a pose not devoid of some majesty. Then he cowardly again. And no force could stop his small lynx. If the lantern was moved, I saw Gollo's horse ride over the window curtains, rounding on the folds and descending into the recesses. The body of Gollo himself, made of the same extraordinary substance as the body of his horse, adapted to every material obstacle, to every object that blocked his path, it turned it into its frame and filled it with itself. Even the doorknob was instantly applied and floated on it by his red robe or his pale face, all the same thin and sad, but not showing the slightest sign of embarrassment from this bonelessness of his. Clearly, I found beauty in the light images that seemed to radiate the Merovingian past, scattering sparkles of ancient times around me. But I cannot express how unsettled I was by the intrusion of mystery and beauty into the room, which I finally managed to fill with my eye to such an extent that I paid more attention to it than to myself. As soon as the anesthetic effect of the habit ceased, sad thoughts and sad feelings returned to me. The doorknob in my room, which for me differed from all other handles in that it seemed to turn by itself, without any effort on my part, this movement became so unconscious for me, now represented the astral body of Gollo. And as soon as the dinner bell rang, I ran to the dining room, where every evening a large hanging lamp shone, which had no idea about Gollo or Bluebeard, but knew my family and was aware of what stew was, and rushed into my mother's arms. The misfortunes of Genevieve of Brabant tied me even more strongly to her, and Gollo's atrocities made me question my conscience with even greater predilection. After supper I had to leave mother, and mother talked with others in the garden if the weather was fine, or in a small living room where everyone gathered in inclement weather. Everyone, except for my grandmother, who claimed that in the country it is a pity to sit in a stuffy room, and on especially rainy days she had endless arguments with my father, who told me to go to read in my room. So the boy will never be strong and energetic with you, she said with a sad look, but he needs to get better and develop willpower in himself. The father shrugged his shoulders and looked at the barometer. He was interested in meteorology, and the mother, without making a fuss for fear of angering him, looked at him with touching reverence, but not very intently, so as not to somehow penetrate the secret of his superiority. But grandmother in any weather, even when it was raining and Françoise was in a hurry to carry away the precious wicker chairs, otherwise, no matter how wet, she walked in an empty garden, in the pouring rain, throwing back her grey dresses and exposing her forehead to the life-givingness of rain and wind. Finally I can breathe, she said, and ran around the wet paths, cut too symmetrically by a new, devoid of a sense of nature gardener, whom my father asked in the morning if the weather cleared up. She ran around with an enthusiastic jump, controlled by a variety of feelings, which aroused in her soul the rapture of a thunderstorm, the power of a healthy lifestyle, the absurdity of my upbringing and the symmetry of the garden, and the desire to protect her purple skirt from dirt, which she managed to splash so much that the maid was perplexed and in despair from the height of the spray, was not familiar to her. If grandmother was making circles in the garden after dinner, then only one thing could drive her into the house. She, like a midge, was drawn to the lighted windows of the small living room, where bottles of strong drinks stood on the card table, and at the moment when she, having made another full turn, turned out to be under the windows, the voice of my great-aunt was heard: "Bathilda, forbid your husband to drink cognac." In fact, to tease my grandmother, she was very different from the rest of my father's family, and everyone made fun of her and pestered her. My great-aunt encouraged my grandfather, who was forbidden to drink strong drinks, to drink a little. The poor grandmother, entering the room, turned to her husband with a plea not to drink cognac. He got angry, still drank a glass, and grandmother left sad, confused, but with a smile on her face. She was so meek and kind that love for her neighbors and the ability to forget about herself and the offenses caused to her were expressed in her smile, whose irony, in contrast to the smiles of most people, applied only to herself. But she sent us a kiss with her eyes, when they were directed at those who aroused tender feelings in her. She certainly had to caress them with her eyes. The torture to which my great-aunt subjected her, her vain pleading and her weakness of character, doomed to suffer defeat and vainly tried to take away a glass from grandfather, all this was one of the phenomena that you get so used to that in the end you watch them with laughter. Moreover, quite resolutely and cheerfully you take the side of the persecutor in order to convince yourself that there is, in fact, no persecution here. But then I was so disgusted by all this that I would have gladly beaten my great-aunt. And yet when I heard, "Bathilda, forbid your husband to drink cognac," I, already masculinely cowardly, acted as all of us, adults, act at the sight of injustices and insults. I turned away from them, I went upstairs to weep, right under the roof, into the room next to the classroom, where there was a smell of iris and into which the fragrance of wild black currant poured, growing among the stones of the fence and stretching a flowering branch through the open window. Having a special, more prosaic purpose, this room, from which even the tower of the castle of Rosenville-les-Pins could be seen from afar during the day, served me for a long time, of course, because only there I had the right to lock myself with a key. A refuge where I could to indulge in what requires inviolable solitude, where I could read, dream, bliss and cry. Alas! I did not know that my grandmother was much more upset than the minor violations of the regime allowed by her husband, my lack of will and poor health, which inspired her anxiety for my future, when, with her head on one side and looking up, day and evening, endlessly circled around garden and her beautiful face, her wrinkled, brown cheeks, which in old age became almost lilac, like arable land in autumn, hiding in the air under a raised veil, with tears running over them from cold or from sad thoughts, unbidden, immediately drying up tears, then disappeared, then appeared. As I went to sleep, I consoled myself with the thought that after I lay down my mother would come to kiss me. But she came to say goodbye to me so briefly and left so soon that my soul resounded painfully, first her steps on the stairs, and then the light rustle of her summer blue muslin dress trimmed with straw, floating behind two doors along the corridor. The rustling and footsteps announced that I would hear them again when she left me. When she went down the stairs, I already preferred that this parting of ours, which I loved so much, happened as late as possible, so that my mother would not come for a longer time. Sometimes, when she, having kissed me, was already opening the door, I wanted to call her and say, "Kiss me again," but I knew that she would be angry because the concession she made to my sadness and my arousal by coming to kiss me, giving me a soothing kiss, irritated my father, who thought this ritual was ridiculous, and she sought to give up this need. this habit, and, in any case, I did not intend to encourage another habit, to ask her to kiss me again at the moment when she was about to step over the threshold. In a word, her angry look violated the peace that she blew over me a second before she lovingly leaned over my bed and, as if holding out the holy gifts of peace to me, reached out to face me so that, having communion, I would feel her presence. And got the strength to sleep. And yet those evenings when my mother came to me for a minute were happy in comparison with those when guests were expected for dinner and she did not rise to me. Usually only Swann visited us. Apart from the occasional visitor, he was almost the only visitor to Combray, sometimes coming as a neighbor for supper, which happened less frequently after his unsuccessful marriage, as my relatives did not receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner, by chance. When we sat in the evening near the house under a tall chestnut tree around an iron table, and from that end of the garden the low and shrill ringing of a bell reached us, with its silent, inanimate rattle, dousing and deafening the household, setting it in motion, entering without a call, but twice, the timid, rounded, golden ringing of a bell for strangers. Everyone asked themselves the question, guests. Who could it be? Although it was no mystery to anyone that it could only be Swann, my great-aunt, wanting to set an example for us, spoke loudly in a possibly more casual tone so that we would stop whispering, because this is extremely impolite towards a guest who might think that we were whispering about him, and grandmother was sent to reconnaissance, rejoicing at the excuse to once again walk through the garden and use it, so that along the way, to make the rose bushes more natural, quietly remove the props from under them, just like a mother fluffs her son's hair, which the hairdresser licked. We racked our brains in anticipation of the news of the enemy that grandmother was supposed to deliver, as if whole hordes could attack us, but a little later grandfather said, "I recognize the voice of Swann." Swann was really recognized only by his voice, his hooked nose, green eyes, high forehead, blonde, almost red hair, combed like Bresson. It was all difficult to see, since we were sitting in the poor light so as not to attract midges, and here without hesitation, I went to tell them to serve syrups. Grandmother was afraid that we might get the impression that syrups are brought in on exceptional cases, only for the sake of guests. It seemed to her that it would be much more decent if the guests saw the syrups on the table. Swann, despite the great age difference, was very friendly with his grandfather, one of his father's closest friends. A beautiful man, but with oddities. Any trifle could sometimes stop his heart impulse, interrupt the course of his thoughts. Several times a year, grandfather told me at the table the same thing, how Swann the father, who did not leave his dying wife day or night, behaved when she died. Grandfather had not seen him for a long time, but then he hurried to the Swann estate, located near Combray, and he managed to lure his friend, who was shedding tears, from the room where death settled while she was being laid in a coffin. They walked through the park, dimly lit by the sun. Suddenly Swann, grabbing his grandfather by the hand, exclaimed, "Ah, my old friend. How nice to walk together on such a wonderful day. Don't you see what a beauty it is, trees, hawthorn, a pond that I dug and which you did not even pay attention to? You are a bile, that's what you are. Can you feel the pleasant breeze? Oh, whatever you say. There is still a lot of good in life, my dear MD." But then he remembered that his wife had died, and, obviously deciding not to delve into how he could rejoice at such a moment, he limited himself to the gesture that he resorted to whenever a difficult question arose before him. He ran his hand over his forehead, wiped his eyes and rubbed his pince-nez. He survived his wife by 2 years. All this time he was inconsolable and nevertheless confessed to his grandfather, "How strange. I think of my poor wife often, but I cannot think of her for long." Often, but not for long, like poor old Swann, became one of my grandfather's favorite expressions, which he used on a variety of occasions. I was inclined to think that old Swann was a monster, but grandfather, whom I considered the most just judge in the world and whose sentence was law for me, on the basis of which I subsequently forgave actions reprehensible in my eyes, objected to me, "What are you doing?" He had a heart of gold. For many years the son of the late Swann had often been to Combray, especially before his marriage, and my relatives did not know that he had broken with the circle of acquaintances of his family and that they, with the excellent innocence of the unsuspecting innkeepers who had admitted the famous robber, they give hospitality to a man whose name represented for us a kind of incognito. For Swann was one of the most elegant members of the Jockey Club, a close friend of the Earl of Paris and the Prince of Wales, a welcome guest of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. The ignorance in which we were about the brilliant secular life of Swann, of course, was partly due to his restraint and secrecy, but also to the fact that the inhabitants of that time drew a society for themselves on the Hindu model. It seemed to them that it was divided into closed castes, that each member of this society, from birth, occupies the same place in it as his parents occupied, and that from this place nothing, except rare cases of a dizzying career or unexpected marriage, is able to transfer you to a higher caste. Swann's father was a stockbroker. His offspring was destined until his death to belong to that caste, where the amount of income, as in the salary sheet, fluctuated between such and such a figure. His father's acquaintances were known. Consequently, his acquaintances were also known. It is known with whom he befits to hang out. If he had any other kind of connections, then the old friends of his family, such as my relatives, looked the more willingly through their fingers at these relations of a young man, because, having become an orphan, he continued to visit us constantly. However, one could safely bet that he would not have dared to bow to these unknown persons in our presence. If one were to compare Swann's share with that of other sons of stockbrokers of the same caliber as his father, then this weight would be slightly lower for him, because he was a very unpretentious person, was obsessed with old things and in pictures, and now lived in an old house, which he filled up with his collections and where my grandmother wanted to go, but the mansion was on the Orleans embankment, and my great-aunt thought it was indecent to live there. "Are you really an expert?" she asked Swann. "I'm asking this question in your own interests. It's true that the merchants are giving you all sorts of scribbles." She really was convinced that Swann did not understand anything about this. Moreover, she generally had a low opinion of his mind, because in conversations he avoided serious topics, but showed awareness in very prosaic matters, and not only when, entering into the smallest details, supplied us with cooking recipes, but also when my grandmother's sisters talked to him about art. If they pestered him to speak out, to express his admiration for some picture, he stubbornly kept silent, so that it became almost indecent, and got rid of them by giving exact information in which museum it was located and when it was painted. But he usually limited himself to telling us, in order to amuse us, each time a new story that he had with someone we knew, with the Combray apothecary, with our cook, with our coachman. Of course, his stories made my great-aunt laugh, but she could not understand why. The funny role that Swann invariably played in them, or the wit of the narrator. "Well, you are an eccentric, Swann." Since she, the only member of our family, was rather vulgar, when it came to Sven in front of strangers, she tried to screw in that if he wanted, he could live on Haussmann Boulevard or on Opera Street, which his father left him 4 million, or even 5, but that he let himself into a whim. However, this whim seemed amusing to her, and when Swann brought her a box of sugared chestnuts in Paris on New Year's Eve, then, if she had anyone at that time, she did not miss the opportunity to ask Swann the question, "Well, Mr. Swann, do you still live near the wine warehouses? Are you afraid to miss the train when you have to go along the Lion Road?" And then she sideways, over her pince-nez, glanced at the guests. But if she had been told that Swann, who, as the son of the late Swann, was ranked among the ranks of those whom the colour of the Third Estate accepts, the most respected Parisian notaries and lawyers, meanwhile, Swann, apparently, neglected this privilege of his, lives a double life, that, having left us in Paris, instead of going home to sleep, which he informed us about before leaving, he turned back around the corner and went into such a drawing room, where not a single broker and not a single broker's assistant was allowed on the threshold. This would have seemed just as improbable to my great-aunt-grandmother, as it would have seemed to a more well-read lady. The implausible idea that she is acquainted with Aristoas and that after conversations with her he plunges into the underwater kingdom of Phaethidino, into a region inaccessible to the eyes of mortals, where, as the story goes, Virgil, he is received with open arms, or, to use for comparison the image that my great-aunt might have thought of, because he looked at her in Combray from small plates, as implausible as the idea that she was to dine with Ali Baba, who, having made sure that he alone will penetrate into a cave where innumerable treasures shine. One day Swann was dining somewhere in Paris and, coming from there to us, apologized that he was in a tailcoat, and when he left, François, according to his coachman, said that he had dined with the princess. At the half-light princess, shrugging her shoulders and not lifting her eyes from knitting, my great-aunt picked up with a cold-blooded mockery in her voice. In a word, she looked down on him. She considered that acquaintance with us should be flattering for him, and therefore found it quite natural that in the summer he never appeared with us without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and each time he brought me photographs of great works of art from Italy. My family did not hesitate to send for him when we needed a recipe for a gourmet sauce or pineapple compote for dinner parties to which he was not invited, because he was not so widely known that he could be trumped up in the company of people who today is the first time in our house. When it came to persons of the French royal house, my great-aunt, turning to Swann, in whose pocket, perhaps, lay a letter from Twickenham, said, "Neither you nor I will ever have anything in common with these people. We'll manage somehow without them, right?" On those evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, she made him accompany her and turn the notes she showed in relation to this man with whom so many sought acquaintance, the ingenuous rudeness of a child, handling some rare thing so casually, as if she penny price. Swann was already known to many club-goers at that time, and my great-aunt, of course, pictured him completely different to herself, saturating and enlivening everything that she knew about the Swann family, which rose against the backdrop of evening darkness in the Combray garden after twice hesitantly a bell rang, the dark and indefinite figure of a man led by my grandmother and whom we recognized by his voice. But after all, even if we approach us from the point of view of everyday trifles, even then we do not represent something outwardly integral, unchanged, with which everyone is free to get acquainted as with a trade agreement or a will. The outward appearance of a person is the product of our thoughts about him. Even such a simple act as seeing a friend is, to a certain extent, an intellectual act. We supplement its appearance with the ideas that we have already formed, and in the general outline of it that we are sketching, these ideas undoubtedly play the most important role. In the end, they learn to puff out their cheeks so deftly, follow the line of the nose with such obedient accuracy, so skillfully blend into all the shades of the sounds of the voice, as if our acquaintance were only a transparent shell, and every time we see his face and hear him voice, we capture our ideas about it. Of course, my relatives, out of ignorance, did not endow that Swann, whom they created for themselves, with many of the properties developed in him by his social life and contributed to the fact that other people looked at his face as a realm of grace, the natural boundary of which was a hump nose. On the other hand, my relatives could pour into his face, devoid of its charms, filled with nothing and capacious, into the depths of eyes that had lost their charm, a vague and sweet sediment, half alive, half forgotten, left over from the hours of leisure spent weekly with him after dinner in the garden or at the card table, at the time of our oral good neighborliness. The corporeal shell of our friend was so saturated with all this, as well as the memories of his parents, that this Swann became a complete and living being, and I get the impression that I am parting with one person and leaving for another, unlike him, when, straining my memory, I pass from that Swann, whom I later knew well, to the first Swann. In him I again recognize the captivating delusions of my youth, and, by the way, he looks not so much like the second Swann, but like other people, with whom I was then familiar with. One might think that our life is a museum, where all the portraits of one era have a family resemblance, a common tone, to the first Swann, exuding leisure, smelling of tall chestnut, raspberries and, a little bit, dragon grass. However, one day, when my grandmother asked the Marquis de Villeparisis, from the noble family of Bouillon, whom she met in Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, in accordance with our idea of castes, despite mutual sympathy, she did not want to maintain relations, the Marquis said to her, "If I'm not mistaken, you're on good terms with Swann, a close friend of my nephew's named Dillon." Grandmother returned delighted with the house overlooking the garden. The Marquis de Villeparisis advised her to rent an apartment here, and also with the waistcoat and his daughter, who had an establishment in the yard and where, having torn her skirt on the stairs, she went to ask to mend it. To my grandmother, these people seemed the height of perfection. She announced that the baby was a real treasure, and that she had never met such well-mannered, such nice people as a waistcoat. The fact is that good breeding, in her opinion, did not at all depend on social status. She admired one answer of the waistcoat and said to her mother, "So you wouldn't tell Sévigné." But about the nephew of the Marquis de Villeparisis, whom she saw with her, the grandmother responded like this, "Ah, daughter, how ordinary he is." The words of the Marquis de Villeparisis about Swann did not raise him in the eyes of my great-aunt, and the Marquis de Villeparisis was humiliated. It seemed that the respect that we, relying on my grandmother, had for the Marquis de Villeparisis, obliged her not to drop her dignity in our eyes, but she dropped it, because she knew about the existence of Swann and allowed her relatives to hang out with him. How? Does she know Swann? And you still assure me that she is related to Marshal MacMahon. The opinion of my relatives about Swann's acquaintances was strengthened, as they believed, by his marriage to a woman from a bad society, almost a cocotte, whom, however, he did not try to present to us, continuing to be alone, although less and less, but who seemed to give them the ability to judge an environment unknown to them, and yet they assumed that he took it from there, where he constantly rotated. But then one day grandfather read in the newspaper that Swann was a regular visitor to Sunday breakfasts at Duke X, whose father and uncle held the highest posts under Louis Philippe. It should be noted that grandfather showed a special curiosity for all sorts of small facts that helped him mentally penetrate the private lives of people like Mole, like the Duke of Paquia, like the Duke of Broye. He was happy that Swann was meeting people who knew them. And the great-aunt interpreted this news in an unfavorable sense for Swann, a person who chooses his acquaintances outside his caste to which he belongs by birth, outside his social class, is experiencing, from her point of view, a pernicious process of declassing. It seemed to her that such a person refuses the benefits that lie in good relations with all respectable people, and after all, those who are more prudent, remembering their children, consider it an honor to maintain such relations and value them. My great-aunt even refused the house to the son of our friend the notary, because he married the radiant and thus stooped in her eyes to the point that he exchanged the honorary position of the son of a notary for the position of one of those crooks, lackeys and stablemen, who, queens were rumored to have shown favor in the old days. She rebelled against my grandfather's intention the very next evening, when Swann came to dinner with us, to ask him what kind of friends he made without our knowledge. My grandmother's two sisters, old maids, who shone with their spiritual qualities, but not with their intelligence, for their part expressed bewilderment what kind of pleasure their son-in-law finds in talking about such trifles. Both of them were with lofty concepts and therefore could not stand washing, as they say, bones. They were not even interested in historical anecdotes. In general, they were not interested in everything that is not directly related to the beautiful and lofty. They were so indifferent to everything that apparently had a direct or indirect bearing on social life, that their auditory organs, having finally come to the conclusion that when a conversation at the table takes on a frivolous or even low tone, and both old maids are not enabled to turn him to objects dear to them, then they simply do not need them. They stopped perceiving sounds for this time, and, in essence, this was the beginning of their atrophy. If grandfather needed to attract the attention of two sisters, he resorted to the signals used by psychiatrists dealing with pathologically absent-minded subjects, tapping a glass with a knife, accompanied by a menacing shout and a menacing look, to those cruel means that psychiatrists often use in communication with people who are healthy, either out of professional habit, or because they think everyone is a little crazy. On the eve of the day when Swann, intending to come to dinner with us, sent a box of wine to the sisters, they showed a more keen interest in Swann, because my great-aunt, holding the number Figaro in her hands, were next to the name of Corot's painting, which hung at the exhibition. It was printed, from the collection of Mr. Charles Swann, asked, "Did you notice that Figaro honored Swann?" "I always said he had good taste," Grandma put in. "Well, of course. Do you ever agree with us on anything?" my great-aunt remarked, knowing that grandmother never agrees with her, and that we do not always take her side. She made an attempt to wrest from us an indiscriminate condemnation of grandmother's opinion. She wanted to force us to join her. But we kept silent. The grandmother's sisters expressed a desire to talk to Swann about the article in Le Figaro, but my great-aunt advised them not to do so. Every time she was convinced of someone's superiority over herself, even the most insignificant, she accustomed herself to the idea that this was not superiority, but a vice, and in order not to envy this person, she pitied him. In my opinion, you will not give him pleasure with this. At least, would be very unpleasant to see that my name was completely printed in the newspaper. I was not at all flattered if they spoke to me about it. However, she did not have to persuade her grandmother's sisters for a long time, out of disgust for vulgarity. They were so sophisticated in the art of hiding personalities under cunning allegories that a person often did not notice the hint. And my mother only thought about how to convince my father to talk to Swann, but not about his wife, but about the daughter whom Swann idolized and for whom, according to rumors, he finally decided to marry. Tell him 2 words. Ask how she is doing. You can't be so cruel. Father got angry. Well, I do not. What nonsense is on your mind? It would be just stupid. The only one who was waiting for Swann with excruciating anxiety was me. The fact is that when we had guests in the evening, or at least only Swann, my mother did not come up to my room. I had dinner before everyone else, then I came to sit with the guests, and at 8 o'clock I had to go up to my room. I had to take with me from the dining room to the bedroom that precious, fragile kiss that my mother used to give me when I was in bed before I fell asleep, and while I undressed, protect it so that its tenderness would not break, so that its volatility does not dissipate and evaporate. But just on those evenings when I felt the need to be especially careful with him, I had to abduct him in a hurry, in front of everyone, without even having the time and inner freedom to bring into my actions the concentration of maniacs who, shutting door, they try not to think about anything, so that, as soon as painful uncertainty seizes them again, they victoriously oppose the memory of how they closed the door. We were all in the garden when the bell tinkled twice indecisively. We knew it was Swann, and yet we looked at each other inquiringly and sent my grandmother to investigate. Don't forget to articulately thank him for the wine, the grandfather advised his sisters-in-law. Wine, as you know, is wonderful. He sent a huge box. Just don't whisper. My great-aunt said. It's not very pleasant to be in a house where everyone is whispering. Ah, Swann. Now we will ask him what the weather will be like tomorrow, said the father. Mother decided that her one word would be enough to make amends for all the wrongs that our family had caused Swann after his marriage. She found an excuse to take him aside. and I followed her. I could not let her go a single step, because I was about to part with her and, leaving the dining room, go upstairs to my room, not consoled by the thought, as on other evenings, that she would come to kiss me. "Tell me about your girl, Swann," said the mother. "She probably already loves beautiful things, like her dad." "Let's go sit on the veranda," grandfather said, coming up to us. The mother had no choice but to stop talking, but this interruption led her to a happier thought, the way the tyranny of rhyme makes good poets achieve perfection. "We'll talk about her in private," she said quietly to Swann. "Only a mother can understand you." I am convinced that her mother is of the same opinion. We sat around the iron table. I tried not to think of the dreary hours I was to spend alone, without sleep, in my room. I persuaded myself that this should not be upset, because tomorrow morning I would forget about them. I tried to concentrate on thoughts about the future, which were supposed to lead me, as if over a bridge, over a close and terrible abyss. However, my mind, overwhelmed with anxiety, as tense as the glances I threw at my mother, was inaccessible to external impressions. Thoughts penetrated into him, but in such a way that everything beautiful or even funny, capable of moving me or entertaining me, remained outside. Just as a patient, clearly aware that he is undergoing an operation, does not feel anything thanks to the anesthetic, so I, without experiencing the slightest excitement, could recite my favorite poems or, without a shadow of a smile, watch how grandfather tries to talk to Swann about the Duke of D. or de Fourpequire. Grandfather's attempts were not successful. As soon as he asked Swann a question about this orator, one of the grandmother's sisters, whose ears perceived the grandfather's question as a deep but inappropriate silence, which politeness required to break, turned to the other. "You know, Flora, I met a young Swedish teacher and she gave me extremely interesting details about cooperatives in the Scandinavian countries. We'll have to invite her to dinner with us." "Well, of course," Flora replied. I didn't waste any time either. I met at Vintil's with a well-educated old man who knew Morban well, and Morban told him in great detail how he was working on the role. Extremely interesting. It turns out that this old man is a neighbor of Vintil, and I did not know. He is very kind. Not only Vintil has amiable neighbors, exclaimed her sister Sedina, in a voice that was loud with shyness and unnatural with premeditation, and at the same time cast a look at Swann that she called significant. Guessing that Sedina thus expressed gratitude for Asti, Flora also fixed a look on Swann, expressing not only gratitude, but also mockery, either simply emphasizing Gray's resourcefulness, or showing that she envied Swann, since it was he who inspired her sister, or maybe she simply could not to make fun of him, as I was sure that he now feels himself in the position of a defendant. I think this gentleman will not refuse to come to us, Flora continued. He can talk about Morban or Maternus for hours, you just have to start talking about them. That must be very interesting, said grandfather with a sigh, whose mind nature, unfortunately, completely deprived of the ability to take a keen interest in both Swedish cooperatives and Morban's work on the role, just as she forgot to give the mind of my sister's grandmothers with at least a grain of salt, without which even a story about the intimate life of Mole or the Count of Paris will seem insipid. You know, Swann turned to grandfather, what I'm about to tell you now has more to do with your question than it might seem at first glance, because if you look at life from a certain angle, you can't help but come to the conclusion that she hasn't changed much. In the morning I reread Saint Simon and found a place of interest to you. It is in the volume where Saint Simon tells how he was ambassador to Spain. This is not one of his best volumes, Before You is just a diary, but a wonderfully written diary, and in this alone its enormous advantage over the most boring newspapers that we consider ourselves obliged to read in the morning and in the evening. I don't agree with you, sometimes reading newspapers is a great pleasure. His grandmother Flora interrupted him, alluding to an article in Le Figaro about a painting by Corot that belonged to Swann. This is when newspapers report on events or people that interest us. Grandma said Dina picked up. Yes, I don't argue against that, Swann remarked with surprise. I blame the newspapers for drawing our attention to various trifles every day, and books that talk about important things. We read some 3 or 4 times in our lives. If we so impatiently tear every morning the parcel in which the newspaper is enclosed, it means that we need to change the state of things and print in the newspaper, well, let's say, Pascal's thoughts. In order not to be considered a pedant, Swann pronounced the word thoughts pompously and ironically, and vice versa, in a volume with a golden edge, which we open no more than once every 10 years. He added with that disdain for high society that other secular people on themselves, we should have read that the Queen of the Helms left for Cannes, and that the Princess of Leon arranged a costume ball. In this way the balance would be restored. But Swann immediately regretted that, though in passing, he had begun talking about serious subjects. We had a smart conversation today. I don't understand why, in fact, we started talking about high matters, he remarked mockingly and turned to his grandfather. So, Saint Simon tells how Maulevrier dared to stretch out his hand to his sons. About this very Maulevrier, the Duke says, in this pot-bellied bottle, I have never seen anything but irritation, rudeness and nonsense. Pot-potty or not pot-bellied is another matter, but I know bottles that contain something else, Flora responded brightly, who considered it her duty to thank Swann too, because he gave a seat to both sisters. Gray laughed. Swann was puzzled. I don't know what it was, writes Saint Simon, an oversight or a trick. He continued, but only Maulevrier set out to stretch out his hand to my children. I noticed it in time and prevented it. Grandfather was delighted with the expression, oversight or trick, but Mademoiselle Sedina's surname is Saint Simon, a writer, prevented complete hearing loss, and she became indignant. What's wrong with you? How can you admire it? And what does that actually mean? Why is one person worse than another? If a man has a mind and a heart, does it really matter whether he is a duke or a groom? Your Saint Simon had an excellent system of education, since he forbade children to shake hands with honest people. It's just disgusting. Why are you quoting this? Then grandfather, realizing that with such an obstruction, Swann would not tell amusing stories, annoyedly said to his mother in an undertone, remind me of your favorite verse. It makes it easier for me to live in the world. Oh yes. Too many virtues God has instilled hatred. How well it is said. I kept my eyes on my mother. I knew that I would not be allowed to sit out until the end of dinner and that, not wanting to displease my father, my mother would not allow me to kiss her several times in a row, as if I kissed her at home. That is why I decided, before dinner was served in the dining room and the moment of parting approached, to extract from this instant flying kiss in advance everything that was in my power, to choose a place on the cheek to which I would press my lips, mentally prepare, conjure up the beginning kiss, so that only later, when my mother gives me a minute, to completely surrender to the feeling of how my lips touch her cheek. So the artist, bound by the short duration of the sessions, prepares the palette in advance and from memory, using his sketches, does everything for which the presence of nature is not required. But even before the dinner bell rang, Grandpa committed an unintentional cruelty. The baby looks tired, he said. It's time for him to sleep. Today we are late with dinner. Father usually did not follow the charter as strictly as grandmother and mother, but then he said, yes, go to bed. I just wanted to kiss my mother when they called for dinner. No, leave your mother alone, enough of these veal tendernesses, wish each other good night, that's all. Go, go. And I had to leave without communion, I had to climb from step to step, as they say, reluctantly, because my heart wanted to return to my mother, who did not kiss me and, therefore, did not give her heart permission to leave with me. This hated staircase, which I always climbed so dejectedly, smelled of varnish, and its smell to a certain extent permeated and strengthened that special sadness that I felt every evening. It made it, perhaps, even more painful for my receptive nature, because my mind was unable to fight it, because it acted on the sense of smell. When we are still asleep and perceive a toothache in the form of a young girl, whom we are trying hundreds of times to pull out of the water, or in the form of a Molière verse, which we repeat tirelessly, then what a great relief comes for us when we wake up and give an opportunity to get rid of the mind from the thought of a toothache with the heroic or rhythmic outfit. I felt something directly opposite to such relief. I inhaled the smell of varnish emanating from the stairs, and inhalation is much more poisonous than penetration through the brain, and therefore sadness at the thought that I had to climb the stairs took possession of me immeasurably faster, almost instantly, insidiously and at the same time rapidly. When I got to my room, I had to lock myself tightly, close the shutters, dig my own grave, throwing back the blanket, and put on a shroud in the form of a nightgown. However, before burying myself in an iron bed, which was brought into my room, because in the summer it was very hot for me under the rep canopy that hung the other, large bed, I showed self-will. I resorted to the convict's trick. I wrote my mother a note, begging her to come up to me on an important matter, which I could only communicate to her verbally. I was afraid that my great-aunt Françoise's cook, who was assigned to look after me at Combray, would refuse to hand over the note. I was tormented by the fear that the request to give my mother a note in front of a guest would seem to her as impossible as it would be for an usher to hand a letter to an actor on stage. Françoise had her own code of do's and don'ts, strict, extensive, cunning and implacable, with incomprehensible and unnecessary distinctions, which gave it a resemblance to the ancient laws, which were so fierce that they ordered the killing of infants and at the same time, they showed excessive scrupulousness, forbidding the boiling of a kid in its mother's milk or eating the sciatic nerve of an animal. If we judge Françoise's code of laws by the sudden stubbornness with which she refused to carry out some of our orders, then one involuntarily comes to the conclusion that the complexity of social relations and secular subtleties provided for by this code could not have been suggested to Françoise by her environment and the way of life of a village servant. Obviously, deep French antiquity lived in it, noble and inaccessible to the understanding of others. So in industrial cities an old building testifies that it used to be a palace. The workers of a chemical plant are surrounded by elegant sculptures depicting the miracle that happened to Saint Theophilus, and 4 sons Imona. I could have a faint hope that in this case Françoise would violate the article of her code, according to which she had the right to disturb her mother in the presence of Mr. Swann because of such an insignificant person as I, only in case of a fire. But meanwhile this article Françoise expressed her respect not only to my relatives, this is how the dead, clergymen and monarchs are honored, but also to a stranger who is invited to visit, and this respect of hers, perhaps, would have touched me if I had read about him in a book, but it irritated me when Françoise expressed it, irritated her solemn and touching tone, especially solemn that evening, for the meal was sacred in her eyes, due to which she would not dare to violate her ceremonial. And so, in an effort to increase the chances of success, I did not stop at lying. I said that I did not write to my mother of my own free will. This is my mother. When we said goodbye to her, she told me not to forget to answer about one thing, which she asked me to look for, and if my note is not given to her, then, of course, she will be very angry. I think that Françoise did not believe me. Like primitive people, whose feelings were sharper than ours, she, by some signs incomprehensible to us, instantly guessed the truth that we tried to hide from her. She examined the envelope for 5 minutes, as if examining the paper and handwriting could give her an idea of the contents of the note and suggest which article should be applied here. She then left with a resigned air that seemed to say, "What a misfortune for parents to have such a child." She returned immediately and said that they were still eating ice cream and the barman could not pass the note on in front of everyone, but that when they rinsed his mouth, he would somehow manage to pass it to my mother. I immediately calmed down, my situation has improved compared to the one in which I was just now, parting with my mother until tomorrow. My note, of course, will make my mother angry, especially since my cunning will make me look ridiculous in front of Swann, but she will introduce me, invisible and jubilant, into the room where my mother is sitting. She will whisper to my mother about me, thanks to which the forbidden, hostile dining room, where even ice cream, a granite block, and glasses for rinsing the mouth, was concealed, as it seemed to me even a second before the return of Francois's pernicious and deadly boring pleasures. Since my mother receives them away from me, this dining room will now be open to me and, like a ripe fruit tearing the peel, is about to splash and splash my mother's attention to my suffering heart at a time when she will read my lines. Now I was no longer fenced off from her, the barriers collapsed. We were again bound by a wonderful thread. And that's not all. My mother will undoubtedly come to me. It seemed to me that if Swann had read my notes and guessed what its purpose was, then my anguish would have seemed ridiculous to him. Meanwhile, later I became aware that the same longing tormented him for many years, and, perhaps, no one would have understood me as he did. This melancholy that attacks when a beloved being has fun where you are not, where you cannot be with him, evoked love in him, for which this melancholy, in essence, was created, which will certainly appropriate it for itself and for itself, will accommodate. If, as it was with me, longing comes upon us before love appears in our life, then, in anticipation of love, it, vague and free, having no definite purpose and flying from feeling to feeling, now serves as filial affection, tomorrow, friendship with a friend. Moreover, Swann also knew the joy that my first experience brought me when Francois came to tell me that a note would be handed over, that deceptive joy that our friend or relative of the beloved woman gives us when, on his way to the house or to the theatre, where he is supposed to meet her at a ball, at a festival, at a premiere. He notices that we are hanging around at the entrance, hoping in vain that chance will bring us together with her. He recognizes us, casually approaches us, asks what we are doing here. We invent that we need his relative or friend on an urgent matter. He assures us that arranging a meeting with her is as easy as shelling pears, invites us to enter the lobby and promises to send her to us in 5 minutes. How we bless him! This is how I was blessing Francois now, this benevolent intermediary, whose one word made acceptable, humane, and even almost pleasant for us the enigmatic, demonic triumph, during which, as we had just imagined, hostile whirlwinds, vicious and intoxicating, they carry us away, and even make us mock us, the one we love so much. Judging by this relative who approached us and was initiated into the cruel sacraments, there is nothing demonic in other invitations to the holiday either. And so we penetrate into the inaccessible and painful for us world of pleasures tasted by it and unknown to us, as into a gap suddenly opened before us, and now we already imagine, we possess, we partake, we almost ourselves create one of the moments that make up this fun. A moment no less real than all the others, perhaps even the most important for us, because our beloved is especially connected with him. This is the very moment when she will be told that we are down there. And, of course, the subsequent moments of the festivity, in essence, should not be so different from this, cannot be more wonderful than this, and cannot cause us such spiritual pain, since a well-meaning friend announced, yes, she will gladly come down to you. It will be much more pleasant for her to talk to you than to be bored upstairs. Alas! Swann knew from experience that the good intentions of a third person have no power over a woman who is irritated that a man she does not love follows her even at a ball. A friend often comes down to us alone. Mother did not come and, not sparing my vanity, interested in the fact that the fiction about the search, the result of which she supposedly asked me to tell her, was not exposed, she ordered Francois to tell me. There will be no answer, words that later so often did porters in luxury hotels or lackeys in gambling houses say to poor girls in my presence. How? Did he say nothing? They asked in astonishment. Cannot be. After all, you gave him my letter. Okay, I'll wait. And, like one of these girls, who invariably assures the doorman that she does not need the extra gas jet that he wants to light for her, she remains to wait and hears only how the doorman and the messenger talk from time to time about the weather and, like the doorman, suddenly noticing that the time indicated by one of the guests has come, he tells the messenger to put the drink in a bucket of ice. I, rejecting Françoise's offer to make me a tincture and stay with me, sent her to the pantry, and I myself lay down and closed my eyes, trying not to listen to the voices of my relatives drinking coffee in the garden. But after a few seconds, I felt that, having written a note to my mother, I, at the risk of angering her, got so close to her that I seemed to feel the moment of her appearance and thereby deprive myself of the opportunity to fall asleep without seeing her, and my heart with every moment I beat more and more painfully, because, persuading myself to calm down and submit to my bitter fate, I only increased my excitement. Suddenly, the anguish passed and was replaced by bliss. As if a strong painkiller began to work, I decided not to even try to fall asleep without seeing my mother, and by all means kiss her when she goes up to her bedroom, even if it is for a long time. After that she got angry with me. The end of torment, expectation, thirst and fear of danger. All this filled my soul with extraordinary delight. I silently opened the window and sat down at the foot of the bed, so as not to be heard below. I sat almost motionless. Outside the window, all the objects also seemed to freeze in tense silence, afraid to disturb the moonlight, and the light, stretching its shadow in front of each object, more dense and definite than the object itself, doubled it and moved it away, and the whole view as a whole became thinner and unfolded at the same time as a folded drawing is unfolded. What felt the need for movement, for example, chestnut leaves, then moved. But all her trembling, carefully polished, with the observance of the slightest shades, brought to the highest possible degree of perfection, did not splash to the surroundings, did not merge with it, remained isolated. Distant sounds, which stood out against the background of silence that did not absorb them, and which, in all probability, came from the gardens spread out at the other end of the town, were perceived to such an extent finished in each of their semitones that it seemed as if the impression of distance depended only on their pianissimo, like those motifs that the orchestra of the conservatory so masterfully performs on mute. Not a single note is lost, and the listeners get the impression that they sound somewhere far from the concert hall, and old subscribers, in particular, grandmother's sisters, when Swann gave up his place to them, they pricked their ears, as if listening to the distant footsteps of marching soldiers who had not yet turned into the street of Treviso. Knowing my parents, I was aware that my undertaking could have the most serious consequences for me, much more serious than an outsider could expect, such that, according to his concepts, could only entail something really bad. With the upbringing that I received, the degree of importance of actions was determined differently than in other children. I was taught to enroll in the category of the biggest offenses, probably because I had to be especially carefully protected from them. There's that, like this it became clear to me only now that we usually do it under the influence of nervous excitement. But then this expression was not used in my presence. I was not pointed out the origin of this kind of actions, otherwise I could conclude that it is excusable or that I cannot cope with it. However, I easily distinguished these offenses by the anguish that preceded them, and by the severity of the punishment that followed them, and now I realized that the offense that I had committed belonged to the category of those for which I was severely punished, but only much more important. If I go out to meet my mother when she goes up to her bedroom, and she sees that I got up to once again wish her good night in the corridor, they will not leave me at home anymore, they will send me to college tomorrow. I was in this sure. Well, even if I had to throw myself out the window in 5 minutes, even that would not have stopped me. I had one desire, to see my mother, to wish her good night. I went too far in this desire of mine, it was too late to retreat. I heard the steps of my relatives, who were seeing Swann off. And as soon as the bell at the gate let me know that Swann was gone, I made my way to the window. Mum asked Dad if the lobster was good and if Swann asked him to give him coffee and pistachio ice cream. I didn't like it very much, said the mother. Next time, I'll have to do something different. And how Swann has changed! Exclaimed my great-aunt. He's quite an old man. Swann still seemed to her a youngster, and suddenly she was surprised to find that he was far from being so young. However, all my relatives noted Swann's abnormal, early, shameful old age and believed that he deserved it, like all bachelors, for whom a long today, which does not have its own tomorrow, lasts longer than for others, because they have it is not filled with anything. The moments in the morning are counted one to another, not being distributed among the children. Probably, his bastard wife spoiled a lot of blood for him. After all, in front of the whole Combray, she lives with some kind of Charles. This is the talk of the town. His mother objected that Swann had clearly cheered up lately, and now he doesn't rub his eyes and rub his forehead so often. This was a characteristic gesture of his father. I think he fell out of love with his wife. Of course, I fell out of love, said grandfather. I received a letter from him about this a long time ago, then I did not attach much importance to it, but it leaves no doubt about his feelings for his wife, in any case, his love for her. Yes, well, why didn't you thank him for the estate? Grandpa turned to his sisters-in-law. How did you not say thank you? If it comes to that, in my opinion, did it quite subtly, Grandmother Flora objected. Yes, you did it very well, I admired you, Grandmother Sedine remarked. You didn't fail either. Yes, I'm proud of my phrase about amiable neighbors. That is that what you call thank you? Exclaimed the grandfather. I heard everything perfectly, but God bless me if I realized that this referred to Swann. You can be sure that he didn't understand anything. No, Swann is not that stupid, I'm sure he figured it out. I couldn't say how many bottles and how much they are. Left alone, father and mother sat for a while, then father said, well, if you want, let's go to bed. That's if you want, my friend, I have no sleep in either eye. However, I don't think harmless coffee ice cream would turn me on like that. And the light is on in the pantry. Well, since dear Francoise is still waiting for me, I will ask her, while you are undressing, to unbutton my corsage. And then my mother opened the lattice door from the front to the stairs. Soon I heard her rising to close the window in her room. I slipped into the corridor, my heart was beating so hard that I could hardly walk, but now it was no longer beating with melancholy, but with joy and fear. I saw a candle illuminating the stairwell. Then I saw my mother. I rushed to her. At first, she, not understanding what was the matter, looked at me with amazement. Then anger appeared on her face. She didn't say a single word to me, however. They didn't talk to me for several days because of sheer trifles. If my mother said even one word to me, it would mean that you can talk to me, and, perhaps, it would be even more terrible for me. I would imagine that, in comparison with the terrible retribution awaiting me, silence, a break, rubbish. The word would be tantamount to a calm tone, which is spoken with a servant who is decided to be counted, or a kiss that is given to a son called up for military service, and which under other circumstances would not have been given to him, since there was an agreement to impose a 2-day disgrace on him. But then my mother heard the steps of my father, who came out of the dressing room where he was undressing, and, in order to avoid the scene that he would have arranged for me, his voice choked with indignation said, "Run. Run. It's still not enough for your father to see that you are sticking around like a fool. Come and say goodbye to me," I babbled, dreading the glow of my father's candle creeping up the wall, and at the same time using its approach as a means of blackmail in the hope that my mother, fearing that my father would not find me here if she will persist, she will say, "Go to your room, I will come right away." but it was too late. Our father was standing in front of us. I involuntarily burst out, however, so quietly that no one heard my words, "I'm dead." However, this did not happen. My father constantly withdrew my benefits under the broader regulations adopted by my mother and grandmother. He did not pay attention to principles and did not consider human rights. For completely random reasons, or even for no reason at all, for a minute he would deprive me of a walk so familiar, so sanctified by custom, that it was already a real perjury on his part. Or, as tonight, long before the appointed hour, he announced, "Go to bed," without any talk. But since he had no principles, in the sense that grandmother understood them, one could not really blame him for intolerance either. He looked at me in surprise and angrily, but when my mother, "What's the matter?" he said, "Well, go to him, after all. You yourself said that you don't feel like sleeping, stay with him a little." "I don't need anything. I don't want to sleep or I don't want to, it doesn't change things at all. You can't teach a child." "Yes, no one teaches," shrugging his shoulders, the father remarked. "You see, the boy is upset, he looks dejected, that we are with you. Executioners, or what? And if he goes to bed because of you, what then? He has 2 beds in his room. Tell Francois to prepare a big bed for you, sleep with him. Well, good night. I'm not as nervous as you, I'll fall asleep and alone." Father could not be thanked. He was irritated by what he called sentiment. I froze in place. He was still standing in front of us, tall, in a white nightgown and a scarf of Indian cashmere in purple and pink checks, with which he had tied his head since he had neuralgic pains, and his posture was as if commanding Sarah to say goodbye with Abraham's Isaac on a fresco engraving by Benozzo Gozzoli given to me by Swann. This evening is long gone. The wall on which I saw the candles' rising light is no longer there. In myself, much of what then seemed to me forever indestructible was also destroyed, and much new was erected, from which new sorrows and new joys came, which I could not yet foresee then, just as it is difficult for me to understand the former ones now. For a long time already, my father stopped saying to my mother, "Go with the baby." Moments like this won't happen again for me. But for some time now, as soon as I strain my ears, I perfectly catch the sobs that I found the strength to restrain in the presence of my father and which I broke out as soon as I was left alone with my mother. In fact, the sobs never ceased, and if now I hear them again, it is only because life around me is becoming more and more silent, so the monastery bells drown out the daytime street noise so much that it seems as if they have stopped, but in the evening silence they call again. Mom spent that night in my room. I expected to be kicked out of the house for my wrongdoing. But instead, my parents did me good in a way that they did not reward for any good deed. Even now, when such a favor was shown to me, something unlawful, undeserved by me, affected my father towards me, which was generally characteristic of his attitude towards me and which was explained not so much by premeditated intentions as by his random moods. Perhaps even the fact that he sent me to bed deserves the name of severity less than the severity of a mother or grandmother, because in some ways his nature differed more sharply from mine than theirs, and he probably still does not. I guessed how unhappy I was all the evenings, and meanwhile both my mother and grandmother knew this very well, but they loved me so much that they were not able to get rid of the pain of the soul. They wanted to teach me to overcome it in order to reduce my nervousness and temper my will. My father loved me differently, which is why I find it difficult to say whether he would have had the courage to do so. The only time he realized that I was having a hard time was when he said to his mother, "Calm him down." Mom stayed with me that night and, apparently not wanting to spoil with a single reproach those hours from which I had the right to expect something different, to the question of Francoise, who realized that something unusual was happening, "Mother is sitting next to me, holds my hand and, without stroking me, lets me cry, madam." "Why is the boy crying like that?" answered. "He himself does not know. Francois. He was just nervous. Make me a big bed and go to bed. And so, for the first time, my sadness was regarded not as a misdeed worthy of punishment, but as an illness beyond my control, recognized officially, as a nervous condition for which I am not responsible. I was relieved that I did not have to be ashamed of my burning tears. I realized that this was not a sin. Among other things, I was very proud of this turn of events before Francois. After all, an hour after my mother refused to come to me and from the height of her greatness ordered me to sleep, I was elevated to the rank of adult. My sadness was unexpectedly perceived as a sign of some manhood. I was now free to cry. I should have been happy, but I didn't feel happy. I had the feeling that this first concession by my mother was painful for her, that this was her first rejection of the ideal she created for me, and that for the first time in her life, despite her courage, she admitted defeat. I had the feeling that if I had won a victory, it was over her, that my victory was tantamount to the victory of illness, sorrows or age, that it weakened her will, weakened her mind, and that this evening, which opened a new era, would forever remain in her memory as a sad date. If I had the courage, I would have said to my mother, "No, I don't want to. Don't lie down in my room." But I knew her practical, realistic, as they would now say, mind, which balanced in her the ardently idealistic nature of her grandmother. I knew that now that the mistake was made, my mother would at least prefer to let me enjoy the bliss of peace and not bother my father. Of course, my mother's beautiful face still shone with youth that evening, when she so tenderly stroked my hands and tried to stop my tears. It seemed to me that this should not have happened. Her anger would have been less painful for me than this extraordinary tenderness, which my childhood did not know. It seemed to me that with a blasphemous and stealthy hand I had just drawn the first wrinkle in her soul, that because of me she got her first grey hair. At this thought, I sobbed even more inconsolably, and then it struck me that my mother, who never allowed herself to be tender with me, was suddenly moved and tried to hold back her tears. Realizing that I had noticed this, she said with a laugh, "Oh, you are my sweetheart, oh, you are my siskin. Stop crying right now, otherwise your mother will be as stupid as you. Listen, since we both don't want to sleep, we won't upset each other, let's do something, read something." There were no books in my room. "But what if I bring those books that your grandmother wants to give you for your birthday? Will this spoil your pleasure? Think. You won't be disappointed?" On the contrary, I expressed delight. Then my mother brought a pack of books, and through the paper in which they were wrapped, I could only distinguish that they were of different sizes, but even at first glance, superficial and cursory, I was convinced that they outshine the box of paints that I received in a New Year's gift, and the silkworms I got for my birthday last year. They were The Damned Swamp, François Le Champi, Little Fadette, and The Pipers. As it turned out later, my grandmother first chose for me the poems of Musset, Tom Russo and Unhealthy. Like sweets and cake, she was inclined to think that the powerful breath of genius had no more dangerous and no less life-giving influence on the soul of a child than the influence of fresh air and sea wind exerted on his body. But when my father found out what she was going to give me, he said that it was crazy, then, so that I would not be left without a gift. She went to Jewel Viscount to the bookseller. It was a hot day, and she returned so exhausted that the doctor warned her mother that grandmother should not be so overworked, and changed those books for 4 rural novels by George Sand. "Daughter," she said to my mother, "I would never put harmful books into your child's hands." In fact, she never bought anything from which it would not be possible to extract food for the mind, especially such food that something beautiful delivers to us, teaching us to find pleasure not in achieving worldly well-being and not in satisfying vanity, but in something else. Even when grandmother tried to give someone a so-called useful gift, an armchair, a service, a cane, she would certainly choose antique things, as if the fact that they had not served people for a long time erased a touch of usefulness from them, and they are suitable not so much to satisfy the needs of our everyday life, but to tell about the life of people of bygone times. She wanted me to hang pictures of architectural monuments and beautiful views. But even if what was taken on the photograph she bought was of artistic value, it seemed to her grandmother that photography, this mechanical method of reproduction, instantly gives the reproduced a touch of vulgarity and utilitarianism. She indulged in tricks and strove, if not completely to expel mercantile banality, then at least to limit it, to replace it with art if possible, to layer it with art. She asked Swann if any major artist painted Chartres Cathedral, large fountains of St. Cloud, Vesuvius, and instead of photographs, she preferred to give me reproductions of Corot's Chartres Cathedral, Hubert Roberts' great fountains of St. Cloud, Turner's Vesuvius. This was already a higher stage of art. But if here the photographer was removed from the reconstruction of works of art or nature and replaced by a major artist, then he claimed his rights to reproduce the interpretation. Pushing back vulgarity, grandmother tried to push it back even further. Grandmother asked Swann if there were engravings of this or that work, and, if possible, she preferred to acquire old engravings, which are of interest not only in themselves, but those that recreate works of art in the form in which it is now inaccessible to us. For example, engraving by Morgan, made from Leonardo's Last Supper before the supper was spoiled. It should be noted that grandmother's art of making gifts did not always lead to brilliant results. The idea which I had given myself of Venice from a drawing by Titian, of which the lagoon is supposed to be in the background, was, of course, much less true than that which ordinary photographs might give me. When my great-aunt set about drawing up an indictment against her grandmother, she lost count when she tried to remember how many chairs her grandmother gave to newlyweds or old spouses that broke at the first attempt to sit on them. To put to the test the strength of furniture, on which one could still discern a flower, a smile, a charming fiction of bygone times, would have seemed too petty to my grandmother. She was even seduced by the fact that it was convenient in the things she gave, because it was possible to use this convenience in a way that was already unusual for us. So in ancient turns of speech we are captivated by a metaphor that has been erased in our modern language from frequent use. George Sand's rural novels, which my grandmother was going to give me for my birthday, are reminiscent of antique furniture. They are full of expressions that have fallen out of use and have regained their original imagery, which they have not yet lost in the countryside. And the grandmother chose them, as she would prefer to rent a house with a Gothic dovecote or some other ancient buildings that have a beneficial effect on the human soul, filling it with longing for unrealized time travel. My mother sat down by my bed. She took the book François Le Champi, whose brown cover and incomprehensible title gave in my eyes features of a sharp originality and mysterious charm. I heard that George Sand is an exemplary novelist. This alone made me think that there was something inexpressibly beautiful in François Le Champi. It would not have been stolen from any more or less subtle reader that George Sand's narrative devices, calculated to arouse curiosity or touch, turns of speech that disturb or inspire sadness, migrate from novel to novel. I, on the other hand, considered each new book not as one of many, but as a peculiar personality, closed in on itself. That is why these devices and turns seemed to me an exciting radiation of the special essence of François Le Champi. Under everyday events, under common truths, under current expressions, I caught an unusual intonation, an unusual sound. The action has begun. It seemed all the more confusing to me because at that time I was in the habit of swallowing page after page and thinking about something else. To the gaps caused by my distraction, this time others were added. My mother, who read aloud to me, skipped all the love scenes. That is why those strange changes that take place in the relationship between the miller's wife and the boy, and which are explained by their ever-increasing mutual heartfelt attraction, seemed to me shrouded in a deep mystery, the origin of which it gave me pleasure to look for in the unfamiliar and pleasant-to-hearing name Champi, which for some reason colored in my imagination a boy in a lovely bright scarlet color. Generally speaking, my mother was an unreliable reader, but if she found a genuine feeling in a book, then she became an excellent reader. So true and simple was her tone, so beautiful and soft was the sound of her voice. Even in life, when not works of art, but living beings touched or delighted her, with what touching sensitivity she eliminated from her voice, movements, speeches a hint of cheerfulness that could hurt a mother who had long lost her child, or avoided talking about holidays and anniversaries. If they could remind the old man of his venerable age, talk about the household, if they could seem boring to the young scientist. In the same way, while reading George Sand, from whose novels one breathes kindness and mental health, and my grandmother inspired my mother that this is the most important thing in life, and only much later I managed to convince my mother that in books this is not the most important thing. My mother followed so that her reading was completely free from lisping and unnaturalness, which could spoil the impression of a powerful speech flow, and in each phrase, George Sand, as if written for her voice and, so to speak, completely contained in the register of her responsiveness, put all his innate softness, all his spiritual generosity. In order to pronounce these phrases correctly, she found in herself that cordiality to which they owe their appearance, which dictated them, but which does not find direct expression in words. With this cordiality, mother at the same time moderated the rudeness of tenses of verbs, communicated to the past imperfect and the past perfect that softness that is in kindness, that sadness that is in tenderness, connected phrases one with another, then slowing down the flow of syllables, regardless of their number, and gave phrases rhythm. She managed to breathe into ordinary prose a kind of unceasing life of feelings. My conscience has ceased to torment me. My mother was with me, and I surrendered myself entirely to the power of this tender night. I realized that such a night could not be repeated, that my strongest desire, that my mother be with me while the dreary hours of the night drag on, comes into irreconcilable conflict with the vital necessity and with the desires of all the other members of the family, and that today I have been given the opportunity to realize only as a special favor and exception. Tomorrow I'll be bored again, and my mother won't stay with me anymore. But when the melancholy passed, I usually ceased to understand why I was melancholy. Besides, tomorrow evening was still far away. I inspired myself that I would still have time to come up with something, although this time could not give me anything, because nothing depended on me. The length of the interval only fueled in me the hope that the obstacles could be removed. So, for a long time, when I woke up at night and again remembered Combray, in front of me, against the background of complete darkness, something like an illuminated vertical cut appeared, like a sparkler or an electric torch illuminate and snatch out of the darkness separate parts of the building, between while everything else is shrouded in darkness. On a fairly wide space I dreamed of a small living room, a dining room, the beginning of a dark alley, from which Swann, the involuntary cause of my grief, would appear, and the hall, where I took a few steps to the stairs, which it was so bitter for me to climb. The staircase was the only and, moreover, a very narrow surface of an irregular pyramid, and my bedroom served as its top with a glass door to the corridor. My mother entered me through this door. In a word, it was always visible at the same hour, limited from everything around, emerging from the darkness, an unchanging decoration, like those reproduced on the front page of old plays in editions intended for provincial theatres, the scenery of my going to bed, as if the whole of Combray consisted of 2 floors of a single house, connected by a narrow staircase, and as if it were always 7 o'clock in the evening. It is clear that when asked whether there was anything else in Combray and whether the clock showed a different time there, I would answer in the affirmative. But this would already be a strain of memory. This would be prompted by my rational memory, and since her information about the past does not give an idea about it, I had not the slightest desire to think about the rest of Combray. In fact, he is dead to me. Dead forever? Maybe. There is a lot of chance in all this, and the last chance, death, often does not allow us to wait for the graces with which such chance as memory bestows on us. I find quite plausible the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost become captives of some lower creature, animal, plant, inanimate object. We part with them until the day, for many that never comes, when we approach the tree or when we become the owners of the object that served them as a dungeon. Here they shudder. Here they call to us, and as soon as we recognize them, sorcery loses its power. We release them to freedom, and now they, having conquered death, continue to live with us. The same is true of our past. Trying to resurrect it is a vain work, all the efforts of our consciousness are in vain. The past is out of his reach, in something, in the sense that we get from it, where we least expected to find it. Whether we find this thing in our lifetime or never find it is pure chance. For many years nothing had existed for me in Combray but the stage and the very drama of my going to bed, but on one of the winter days, when I came home, my mother, noticing that I was cold, offered me tea, although I usually didn't drink. I refused, but then, I don't know why, I changed my mind. Mum had ordered one of those round, fluffy biscuit cakes, which seemed to be shaped like grooved shells of lamella mollusks. Dejected by the gloomy today and the expectation of a bleak tomorrow, I automatically raised a spoonful of tea with a piece of biscuit to my mouth. But as soon as the tea with cake crumbs soaked in it touched my palate, I shuddered. Something unusual happened in me. I was suddenly overwhelmed with unreasonable delight. Like a lover, I immediately became indifferent to the vicissitudes of fate, to its harmless blows, to the iridescent transience of life. I was filled with some precious substance, or rather, this substance was not in me, I myself was this substance. I stopped feeling like a mediocre, inconspicuous, mortal person. Where did this omnipotent joy come from? I felt a connection between it and the taste of tea and cake, but it was infinitely higher than this pleasure. It was of a different origin. So where did she come from? What does she mean? How to keep her? I drink another spoonful, but it adds nothing to what the first brought me. The third act's a little weaker than the second. We must stop. The strength of the drink is not the same. It is clear that the truth I seek is not in him, but in me. He awakened it, but he himself does not know it. He is only able to repeat it endlessly, more and more indistinctly and indistinctly, and I, realizing my impotence to interpret the revelation of this truth, want to at least turn to him again and again with a question. I want his action not to weaken, so that he immediately comes to my aid and finally explains everything. I leave the cup and turn to my mind. He must find the truth. But how? A painful indecision fetters him every time he feels that he has gained the upper hand over himself, for it is he, the seeker, that is the dark region in which he must seek, and where all his equipment will not bring him the slightest benefit. Search? No, not only, to create. He stands face to face with something that does not yet exist and that no one, like him, is able to comprehend, and then illuminate. And I again and again ask myself the question, what is this incomprehensible state to which I cannot give any logical explanation, and which, nevertheless, is so certain, so blissful, so real, that before it any other reality fades? I'm trying to recreate this state in myself. I mentally go back to the moment when I drank the first spoonful of tea. I experience the same state, but without the former freshness of perception. I demand from the mind that it make one more effort and at least for a moment hold on to the elusive sensation. Fearing that nothing would interfere with his impulse, I remove all obstacles, all sorts of extraneous thoughts. I protect my hearing and attention from sounds penetrating from the next room. When the mind gets tired of futile efforts, on the contrary, I incite it to distractions that I have just denied it. I allow it to think about something else. I allow it to yell at their highest tension. Then, already for the second time, I remove everything superfluous from it, again bring the still not exhausted taste of the first sip closer to it and feel how something in me shudders, moves, wants to emerge, wants to weigh anchor at a great depth. I don't know what it is, but it's slowly rising. I feel resistance and hear the rumble of space being overcome. What trembles inside me is, of course, an image, a visual impression, inextricably linked with the taste of tea. It tries, after it, to emerge to the surface. But it beats too deep, too indistinctly. I can hardly distinguish the indefinite reflection in which the elusive whirlwind of colors flashing before me merges, but I am not able to make out the form. Ask her, as the only possible interpreter, to translate to me the testimony of her contemporary, her inseparable companion, taste. Ask her to explain to me, which particular case, which of the elapsed periods of time is being discussed. Will this memory, this moment of the past, drawn by a moment like it from such a distant distance, stirred up, lifted from the bottom of my soul, reach the bright field of my consciousness? I don't know. Now I no longer feel anything, the moment has stopped. Perhaps it has fallen again, who knows if it will ever rise again from the darkness. Many times I started again, I leaned over it. And every time, cowardice, distracting us from a difficult task, from a great undertaking, advised me to quit this occupation, advised me to drink tea, thinking about nothing but my today's sorrows and plans for tomorrow. After all, this chewing gum can be chewed endlessly. And suddenly the memory came alive. It was the taste of a piece of biscuit, which in Combray every Sunday morning, on Sundays I did not leave the house until Mass, treated me, soaked in tea all I'm blossom, Aunt Leonie, when I came to greet her. The very sight of a biscuit awakened nothing in me until I had tasted it, perhaps because I later often saw this cake on the shelves of pastry shops, but did not eat it. Its image left Combray and merged with more recent impressions, perhaps because not a single one of the memories that fell out of memory a long time ago was resurrected. They all crumbled, the forms, including the shell cakes, which aroused sharply sensual perception with each austere and pious fold, perished or, immersed in sleep, lost the ability to spread, thanks to which they could reach consciousness. But when there was nothing left of the distant past, when living beings died out and things collapsed, only the smell and taste, more fragile, but more tenacious, more immaterial, more persistent, more reliable, for a long time, like the souls of the dead, reminder they hope, they wait, and these barely perceptible little ones, among the ruins, carry on themselves, without bending, a huge building of remembrance. And as soon as I again felt the taste of the biscuit soaked in linden tea, which my aunt treated me to, although I still did not understand why this memory pleased me so much, and I had to put off the solution for a long time, at the same instant the old grey house with a facade on the street, where the windows of my aunt's room looked out, he was attached, like a decoration, to an outbuilding with windows overlooking the garden, built behind the house for my parents. Only this piece of antiquity still lived in my memory. And as soon as the house appeared, I already saw the town as it was in the morning, afternoon, evening, in any weather, the square where they took me before breakfast, the streets along which I walked, long walks in clear weather. And, as in the Japanese game, when pieces of paper similar to each other are lowered into a porcelain cup with water and these pieces are straightened in the water, take on certain shapes, are colored, each revealing its own peculiarity, they become flowers, buildings, tangible and identifiable creatures, all flowers in our garden and in Swan's Park, Vivona's water lilies, the venerable inhabitants of the city, their houses, the church, the whole of Combray and its environs, everything that has shape and density, the city and gardens, floated out of a cup of tea.